I feel like I've said this about like 90% of game series out there at this point, but I've been meaning to get into Ninja Gaiden for a long time now, but it's always felt a little bit unapproachable despite me being a pretty big action game fan. And it's not because it's a notoriously difficult series, because if anything, I'm always down for a bit of a challenge. It's because it's a notoriously messy series. For a franchise with not that many distinct entries, it has no business being this confusing, because you have Ninja Gaiden, and then Ninja Gaiden 2, and then Ninja Gaiden 3, and then a few ports and re-releases of the original. That all makes sense. But then in 2004, you get Ninja Gaiden. No subtitle or sequel number, just Ninja Gaiden, which still, it's fine, it's just a reset, whatever. But then immediately 1 year later, you get Ninja Gaiden Black, which is the 2004 Ninja Gaiden, but with some nice content tweaks and different difficulty modes that most people consider a little bit better. And then 2 years later, you get Ninja Gaiden Sigma, which was the PlayStation 3 port of the same game that gutted and rearranged things in a way that most people consider a little bit worse. So that's 2 reworkings of the same game in just a few years after its release. Then you get Ninja Gaiden Dragon Sword, which was just a DS game, and then a true sequel to this rebooted series in 2008 with Ninja Gaiden 2. Again, just a year later, you get Ninja Gaiden 2 Sigma, so in this case we've skipped Black, and this is also a reworking that changed the amount of enemies in a lot of areas and removed blood effects, among other things, which people weren't happy with. Then a few years later, there's Ninja Gaiden 3, which people also didn't like, and then the same year we got the reworking with Ninja Gaiden 3 Sigma, which people did like a little bit more, except it's not actually called Ninja Gaiden 3 Sigma or Ninja Gaiden 3 Black, it's called Ninja Gaiden 3 Razor's Edge. And then you get the Master Collection, which is the easiest way to play today with Ninja Gaiden Sigma, Ninja Gaiden 2 Sigma, and Ninja Gaiden 3 Razor's Edge. The only problem is, if you're keeping track, that means it has the best version of Ninja Gaiden 3, the second best version of Ninja Gaiden 1, and the worst version of Ninja Gaiden 2, so OG fans recommend not playing the Master Collection. And now, finally, you have the most modern version of Ninja Gaiden 2 in Ninja Gaiden 2 Black, which is the reverse order of what they did with Ninja Gaiden 1. Needless to say, it is not a very inviting series at first glance, but when Ninja Gaiden 2 Black Shadow dropped last week, it gave me an excuse to just ignore this whole mess and go for it. I don't care that I haven't played the first game, I don't care if this is even the definitive version of 2, I kinda just want to try this series out, and you know what? The game's sick as hell. In terms of the negatives, I only really have 2. The biggest issue here, hands down, is the camera. You've probably heard about this in every single review, whether it's positive or negative. The camera here is just so strange, because it's not like one of those old static cameras where every single action scene is framed in a very specific way, and it's not a fully controllable camera that hinges around the character. Instead, it's this weird middle ground that feels like you're actively wrestling against another person over control of this thing, and that other person is the guy who made the music video for Humble. It just pulls and snaps into all these weird angles that rarely ends up in the exact place you want it. I never got that screwed over by the camera necessarily, but it's also not a pleasant or smooth experience on that front, especially when you're trying to pull off your power moves. The way it frames those is sickening. And the other main issue for me is the lack of variety with the enemy and encounter design, especially in the first half. And then the second half does start to change up that scenery a lot more and has a particularly standout area with all these massive gears, but with that greater breadth, it also loses some of the first half's cohesion. The last few chapters in this game have the same vibe as the end of Return of the King, where the movie just keeps psyching you out and refuses to end. I felt like new enemies were ushered in way too slowly at first, and then at a certain point they just come flooding in. And a lot of the time it doesn't make sense why you're fighting a certain enemy type in the area you're currently in. But I think I prefer the second half's kind of random slapdash nature a bit more than the fairly repetitive encounter design found, particularly in the first third of this game. There is an element to that repetition that makes it kind of fun, like every single fight is a somewhat predictable playground where you can just mess around with the enjoyable combo-based combat, but I feel like there's probably a world out there where you get the freedom to experiment with different moves and weapons without needing to fight 10 ninjas with swords for the 400th time before you finally start fighting ninja with claw. As far as the stuff that I thought was just okay or I was maybe a bit mixed on, the pace of this game is really pedal to the metal at all times, which in my opinion makes it perfect for playing in short bursts, but probably not the best if you're trying to rip through it in a day or two. You can definitely still enjoy it that way, but I wouldn't be surprised if it all started to feel like a blur pretty quickly, so I kind of self-paced myself by only doing a couple of chapters at a time, and I enjoyed it a lot doing that. There's just not really that much to do here outside of combat. There's some very light platforming elements, but but other than that, it's just group fight after group fight, and then bosses usually at the end of each chapter. It is a true red, white, and blue mid-2000s action game, meaning action is really all you get. Speaking of the bosses, I do find these vary in quality quite a bit. Any of the straight-up sword-to-flesh fights I mostly enjoyed, but any gimmick fight that saw you using a ranged weapon or special weapon felt really clunky, because the game is at its most fluid when you don't have to worry about the camera and the wacky-tabacky aim mechanics, and you're just working with its beautifully animated melee system. The proper fights do outweigh the gimmicks maybe 3 to 1, so it's not that bad, but there's definitely a few duds here. But even with these issues, there's a reason that Ninja Gaiden 2 Black Sigma Razors Turbo won me over, so it's time we talked about what it does best. The first thing obviously being the core combat, which looks just as cool if you're pulling off a planned multi-step combo or just slamming buttons together, as long as you're aware enough to block and dodge every once in a while. The game has a really strange but kind of fun control scheme for blocking and dodging, where holding the left bumper lets you block attacks, and then in that stance, if you move around the left stick, you dodge in that direction. It takes some time to get your head around, but it eventually clicks. And once it does, it's really quick, satisfying, and crucial if you want to avoid dying, which, speaking of, as of last night, I finished Ninja Gaiden 2 Black for the first time and didn't die once. Somebody hand me a Grammy or something. I did play this game on normal. There is an easy mode in this version in case you're wondering, but I wasn't on it. And I'm sure a lot of the OG fans are gonna try to take this away from me. You're gonna tell me that the original Ninja Gaiden 2 had like 8 times the number of enemies and normal mode didn't exist and the sun was in your eyes the whole time or something, but I don't care. I can now definitively for the rest of time say that I beat Ninja Gaiden 2 without dying the first time I ever played it, and you can't do shit about it. Regardless of the difficulty, this game still had me hooked all the way through because of how great the melee systems are. Executing a combo in this game does require a level of timing and dexterity, but it's actually a lot easier to pull off than it might look. My personal favorite is this ground pound move because it's really easy, and combined with jumping dash attacks, throws, and slightly aimable sword swings that can target enemy limbs individually in the flow of battle, which then allow you to perform finishers, it's honestly really easy to feel like you're good at this game. And then obviously performing more complex combos, playing on harder difficulties, and expertly balancing offense and defense in such a high-speed environment leaves a lot of room for improvement if you're somebody who loves mastering these sorts of combat systems. And then you throw on top of that all the different weapons with unique movesets, which in a real surprise twist are all fun to use in their own way, and I totally could have seen myself playing through the entire game with any of these. And there's a level of depth here that I unequivocally have not even scratched the surface of. I mean, look at this moves list for a single weapon of your like 10 in this game. This is ridiculous. The story admittedly isn't anything special, but it is presented nicely, just a ton of scenes featuring crazy dragon people and you doing sick little ninja things. Look at that. Hell yeah. And for all you degenerates out there, I haven't seen a game this goony since 1986. It was like a jump scare. And lastly, the remake looks great. I mean, you see it, it's doing exactly what it needs to in my opinion. I have seen some mentions of it being quite demanding and having issues with DLSS, so make sure you check that out before you download this on Game Pass, and especially if you just buy it outright. But I can obviously only speak on behalf of my experience, which, I have a fairly beefy rig, but it didn't run into any issues, no poppin', no frame rate problems, it ran great. Overall, Ninja Gaiden 2 Black isn't doing anything we haven't seen before, which makes sense considering it's the third release of the second game in a reboot trilogy that has 18 different computations now, but it's just got that pure fun factor that I've been really itching for in a game right now. I've been playing some story heavy stuff recently, going back to some old titles. It's good stuff, but sometimes it can get a little bit ugly or have kind of, let's call them restrictive combat systems, so playing this game in between has been a really nice palate cleanser. I really recommend checking it out, especially if you have Game Pass. I'm really excited for Ninja Gaiden 4 also, it looks awesome, and I'm glad I finally took the plunge into this series. I am planning on playing through the rest of them at some point also. If you enjoyed the video, leave a like, subscribe for more video essay speedruns, and I will see you all next time. Bye.